So Thor, how has this research project changed your teaching or changed your kind of self-conception as a teacher? And how do you think it will influence your teaching in the future?
That's a good question, because that's my chapter 5 is all about my becoming. It's the pedagogical tact, the pedagogical understanding of what it was to do this with these students. Is that I have now put a lot of responsibility on myself as an educator, and I do that to all educators in my chapter 5, that we need to be attuned that if we are going to be concerned for our own being as being teachers, there is a way we have to interact with our students and apprentice them, care for them, and that's all about pedagogical understanding, pedagogical tact. And yes, it's transformed me just the way how I project myself and understand myself as an educator. It's the final for the sake of which that Heidegger talks about is, why are we here? Why am I here? I'm here to be an educator. And once you make that your concern, the world kind of opens itself up in ways that allow you to follow that path. And that's what I kind of talked about in chapter 5. So,
now that you're applying for jobs, are you talking about that explicitly in application letters or interviews? And I'd be curious to know from you and from the others as well, how overtly do you talk about your dissertation as kind of influencing who you are as a teacher and as a researcher?
I think I hint at my concern for my being as caring for others as an educator in my letters of intent in my final, because I align to the mission of being a social responsive educator, cultural responsive, critical pedagogue. It's in its essence of being an educator caring for others, caring for the well-being of students. So I do kind of hyphenate caring for others in my letter. So it's not explicit, but it's there. It's also my research agenda as well. Although I try to just stay more of a qualitative researcher, because it might scare some people if they don't really understand what phenomenology is supposed to be. Because phenomenology deals with ontology rather than epistemology. And how long have I been working on this? I started chapter 1 draft, and that was went through 5 drafts, and I'm telling you, it was terrible for the draft. January last year. Finally got a good working draft in May of chapter 1. And chapter 2 kind of went through 3 or 4 iterations too, because chapter 2 sounded like a textbook on how to do digital media, which is not the intention of chapter 2.
I just find it a lovely thing being an English major, because, I spent a lot of time reading books and thinking about metaphors, and so a lot of times in this program I feel like I need to drop all of that. So phenomenology does seem like I can see why so many writers are attracted to it as a methodology, because it really does allow for you to draw from your backgrounds and not ignore this great body of knowledge that's been created outside of the social sciences. And I do think it's knowledge. So there's my epistemological framework.
There you go. One thing about coding I found myself is I paid really attention to the linguistic metaphors students were using to explain their experiences. So when I am coding, I'm very, are they naming a visual metaphor? Are they talking about sounds when they're hearing? Because that's when I start talking about the synesthetic experience of composing multimodal texts. And so if they're using a word, I pay attention to the verbs. Is it a sound, is it a sound? Is it oral? Is it tactile? Is it sensed visually? Kind of how they're naming their experience through what metaphors they use. So it does, I think metaphor is, it said Lakoff and Johnson, all language is metaphor anyway, so it really So that's how I code. That's how I basically structured my coding scheme: was metaphors through body, relationship with others, relationship with story, relationship with time. And then the other ones, place. Did I get them all, Sarah and Maggie? Time, relationship with others, place, and body.
The thing about metaphor that is difficult for me is that I already saw, and I had this conversation with Francine many times, I saw a strong connection between poetry, which to me is a writing of figuring things out, and this phenomenology is a writing of figuring things out, that I didn't see the difference between them. I was having a hard time seeing the difference between them. And the thing that she said, and that I kept finding in other places, and Gadamer talks about it too, is the idea that this is supposed to be metaphor that opens up the experience as opposed to closing down the experience or naming or quantifying or characterizing the experience. And in that way, it allows for an interpretability that isn't present in lots of ed research, and that opens without obscuring the phenomenon. Did I say that right? So, O'Brien is making me laugh. Sarah's having fun. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to say. But because about metaphor, because I also thought, well, why not just write a collection of poems and describe?
Could phenomenology ever be a part of a mixed method study? I think if you're a phenomenologist, you wouldn't even consider that. Quantifying something, according to Heidegger, when you quantify or put things into theoretical frames like numbers, you de-world them, decontextualize them. He says that those are necessary things of the natural sciences, of coming to understand what presence at hand is, substances that are in the world. But as a phenomenologist, I understand that as soon as I start to quantify or take something that I name and put it into a theoretical frame, that I'm actually de-worlding it from the context, from the time, the particular place and time that this is happening. So I don't think phenomenologists would consider doing a mixed method.
So one of the things that I talked about too in my chapter 3 was the idea of where it goes beyond simply interpretive and goes also beyond what's the purview of qualitative research. Is that so? In qualitative research, the researcher tries to explain aspects of time, frequency, methodology, or pedagogy, etc. But in phenomenology, we seek to describe how people experience time, how people experience frequency, and how they experience that pedagogy. And that, I think, moves it to more of, when they say human science, it moves it to kind of, to me, the nature of how human beings experience that phenomenon. That gets to a different why also. I think it moves to a different why also. The purpose to me is different in that it's not necessarily, so the pedagogical implications are not for making pedagogy necessarily. They are for how we are learning beings, as opposed to how you're going to design a better treatment for your students so that they learn to read better. So that's kind of how I see that moving beyond what qualitative research does. When it's done well, then there are people who, anyway, I won't even talk about that, but that's my sort of way I think about it.
And I think Megan said something about that phenomenology can be used as theory building. I see it more as getting so close to the particular that it becomes universal, that the theme arises Now that's different than I think than theory. And I think that in our good stories class we talk about a lot about the universal level of interpretation, and there should be grounded all the way into the particular place and time and the context.
Yeah, that's what I said earlier too about the idea that it's in asking about individual being. You said something, Thor, about finding and losing. The idea of that people talk about finding themselves in the digital storytelling, and that to me is the also sort of the how it is that through getting closer and having a better understanding of your own being, you are moving to an understanding of being. And that to me is also how I sort of see it. That's the play. That's the individual and the particular moving to the universal, and that the groundedness or the sense of it being grounded in a personal experience makes it possible through phenomenology to be explained as universal.
And also going off of that, and this is from the Dreyfus lectures, that when you are opening up the clearing of an understanding, it's always a public clearing that can be understood by others. It's not a private, in my own head clearing. That would be actually more very subjectivist, which goes against what Heidegger was actually writing about. That any clearing that I'm interpreting, the opening up is always going to be a public. It can be named publicly, so done. Open.
Yeah, I feel like I haven't taken phenomenology, so please forgive my ignorance. But I feel like just naming things is an act of theorization in itself. And presumably you guys want, like, this piece of research will have some use, or does it? I mean, is it just for its own sake, like, to document that one particular experience, or does it extend to other uses and other kind of ideas?
Well, if it's a clearing that you're trying to do, the interpretation of a clearing, then you're always trying to extend to other people. So you're inviting them to see the clearing as well. You're inviting a phenomenological nod is something that we all kind of recognize, but we may not be able to name. Kind of almost more of a felt sense. So if you're sitting in a room when someone says something and everyone kind of nods or, oh, yeah, that's what we're trying to get at when we're writing or conducting phenomenology is that, oh, I have experienced something similar to that. It's not the exact same thing. And that it illuminates something new to your own experiences of being in the world. That's my goal.
Theory is sort of a naming of something to close it or to end it. And Merleau-Ponty says like mental activity in a sort of a way that in almost a derogatory way. And the idea of mental activity is that you think of the right answer and you have thought of it. And then, but Heidegger talks about opening a phenomenon to keep it worthy of thought. And the Bachelard idea that he says is that in sorry, I'm so hungry, I can't think. He says that it's poetically useful, right? So the idea of something, an idea or a thought or a feeling being poetically useful means that I think, again, it's a closing down. So theory is, I've got this theory and here it is. You can either chop it down or you can build onto it. I think, again, it moves, or bye, you guys. Sorry. That it moves to more of feeling and away from thinking. So it says, on the contrary, through the brilliance of an image, which is why we use metaphor in phenomenology, the distant past resounds with echoes, and it's hard to know at what depth these echoes will reverberate and die away. Because of its novelty and its action, the poetic image has an entity and a dynamism of its own. He says it's referable to a direct ontology. And he uses the idea of a poetic usefulness. He calls it a sonority of being, right? So that resonance comes from that and doesn't stop coming from that. That it doesn't get to, and now we've made our theory and we're done. So I think that's, to get back to that, I think that's how I would describe it. Can't find the poetic usefulness part of this, though. Oh, no.
And you're saying that has equal or greater validity or purpose for doing this to having a generalizable conclusion in other methodologies. Yes?
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying right now.
Plus, once it becomes generalizable, again, it's been deworlded out of context, space, and time. And since we are beings in time, it's like we're in the flow of time, everything will be changing. So theories change. Our understanding of the world change. If you think about the history of natural sciences, of how their experiences in the world have changed. So that's kind of what we just have we try to have that understanding of that. I mean, naming something we're not trying to ossify it.
If all you're trying to do is replicate prior research, which is something, I guess that's considered like the gold standard, I feel, in reading at this moment, you have by definition shut down fresh thinking. That doesn't mean it could never occur, but by definition you have at least taken some energy away from fresh thinking because you are purposely trying to replicate. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the scientific process. But the problem is, if that's such a, unconquerable orthodoxy, and there's no room for anything else, that's a problem. So, you know what I'm saying? I'm not sure if anything done along those lines, or we just, fueling a fad. And so I think when you name things and you let things be popular, and education is subject to what's popular, and then something new comes along that's popular. So I'm not sure if that's really like the most thoughtful progression from like paradigm to paradigm, I have a hard time communicating with my colleagues unless I use buzzwords. It seems like you have to use buzzwords or people can't even understand you. So that's kind of scary because you could teach, think about the people who play doctors on television. Anybody can learn to speak a certain language. Do they understand what they're doing? Well, not the people who play doctors on television. They're not really doctors. So I don't know. I'm just throwing some stuff out there.
I want to just say, I think there might be an understanding that phenomenology is trying to destroy the natural science kind of understanding of the world. I think it's more of a complementary purpose of why we do what we're doing. I enjoy reading quantitative stuff because it helps my understanding of a phenomenon. I'm just more interested in how or what ways people experience. I think that would be the difference. We need to make room for both, and I think understand both, and both have purposes and reasons for what they do in trying to understand. Like I said, facts are necessary. We need to know that 2 + 2 = 4. But then I'm interested in, well, how does 2 + 2? How is that experienced by people? I guess I think that adds to the body of understanding just as much as the facts do. So I hope we're not trying to demolish the natural science kind of ways of doing things, but we all also have to be aware that in our education research, we're dealing with human beings, and it should be a different way of. Should also have a different way of approaching experiencing research as we are relating with other people, and they're not things, they're not present at hand substances that are just like stars or quarks or black holes. They're sentient, caring, thoughtful, or have the possibility of being all over the place.
Thor, I think you make a good point, though, that to use the 2 + 2 = 4 examples, we have to kind of have that statement, 2 + 2 = 4, and we've all heard that statement, and we all have kind of some sense of what it means in order for us to even get inside the subjective experience of that. I mean, or else how else would we even kind of communicate?
Well, it would be called the disposedness in phenomenology of what the common sense is. We need that to be able to communicate. We need to have, that's how we have language. We have to have commonalities. Where's my notes?
Can I cut you off for a second, Thor? I'm sorry. I was muted for before. I wanted to get back to something Brecca said, which I think applies to this also. So the idea of phenomenology is to make it that those buzzwords are something that we turn our attention to. So then we're then saying, so what do you mean by, even when you say something like transactional theory, what do you mean, but what does that mean in the world to teachers and students and to our understanding of what that language has become? Because it gets dead, it gets deadened, and phenomenology does that. But I think the idea that we're not trying to take apart traditional kinds of research is not necessarily true. I think what we are trying to do is question the assumptions of that research. And in those questioning of those assumptions, we're questioning when 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, and when and for whom it never equals 4. So that, I think, is the way that, of course, we have to have facts, but there's no knowledge that is of all time for all people in all places and for everybody. So I think that's what we keep in mind constantly. And I used the metaphor in my work, and I thought of this through learning more and more about phenomenology, that we keep culture in our hand so that we're constantly aware of it while we try to take apart what makes it. So that it's the seeing of the door frame and the view beyond, and then wondering what the door frame obscures. So I do think it is a taking apart in some ways of the assumptions of the natural sciences to get to, at least we ask these questions. At least we've said, what do you mean by transactional theory of literacy, or what do you mean by the, so anyway.
Or what Heidegger says about the big metaphor of natural sciences, seeing light, you see, the essential metaphor that natural sciences say. So they privilege image, or the sense of being able to see which actually constructs you as out there and me here, which could be problematic. What if we use the metaphor about hearing, where I think Merleau-Ponty says that actually centers us in the world. We become the center of the world. One other thing is that talk about is like common. What I was trying to talk about earlier about why we need kind of facts is that we need to have common sense, because we wouldn't be able to articulate anything to other people if we didn't have a common sense. And Heidegger calls it the one, and I'm using Dreyfus's translation rather than the they. It's like the one who does something, which it could be neutral, or it could be bad of becoming a conformist, where if you're constantly worrying about what the neighbors are thinking about you, is what would be considered conforming to the one. But I think as a phenomenology, we try to make conspicuous one, what it means to do this, what it means to do that. All of our activity is permeated by norms, and it is a part of our familiarity with the world. We all conform to norms all the time, even though we do not notice it most of the time. So that's part of what we're trying to do as phenomenology, is to make conspicuous those things that are in the background that we don't notice.
Post-structural to me, too. I mean, this kind of deconstruction of norms and of power structures and stuff.
One thing that would be different, I think, is there's still an assumption that there is a self separate from the world in post-structuralist theory, whereas phenomenology, we the ontology is that we are the world existingly would be a term Dreyfus says, there's a translation of Heidegger. And Sartre says the same thing, so it's more of an existentialist philosophy.
I just want to say I wrote this, and then it's not going to make any sense unless I clarify. But so that's why I said, which is why when I say culture is in our hand, it's not separate from us. We have to be aware of the fact that we don't exist separate from, as Thor said, knowledge, or separate from understanding, or separate from sexism, or separate from racism, or any of those things. So I think that's what I meant when I said that. So it's why we have culture in our hand, because we can't exist without, there isn't anything separate from us. And then Sarah wrote the Merleau-Ponty quote where he said that he said, where would you say? You put your Merleau-Ponty quote, I can't find it. The body is the center of everything. And then I also put my favorite, which he says, the body is our medium for knowing the world. It's the only way of knowing and understanding anything is through that.
And the body is of the world.
Can I answer your question, Joseph? You're asking that question. So it says, so when you were on in your writing, when you're most confident that you know, you get it in your body. Did you want to answer that, Thor?
When I'm on, and I think Sarah's probably better at explaining this, but I've heard it in the Dreyfus lectures as familiarity, as flow. When you are on, you lose yourself. The I is not thematized anymore. You become the project. And that's totally phenomenology. When you're on, you don't have a sense of I am doing this, I am writing this.
What is your sense then?
You're immersed in the world. And that's bodily, I guess, would be the only way to.
How does that feel?
You wouldn't. The only way you'd have to reflectively think about how it feels, because when you're in it, you're not thinking about how it's feeling. You're just doing it.
For me, if you want to go back to transfer, how it feels for me is that when and I feel like this is the same thing with research. First of all, when I'm saying something that I feel like is true to my experience, there is an electricity to it where I want to share it with people. I want to tell people about it. I get very excited, and I think, who else can know about this? And so that I do think is true, and that's a bodily feeling for sure. But then the other thing is that what Megan said about transfer earlier is that I begin to see it occurring in aspects of my life that are as unrelated as cooking is to, how I drive the car and how I'm dealing with my children. So I feel like that's one of the ways where it does have a sonority of being again, which is that it's not research that I do, it becomes the research that I am. And that is, in case I'm not trying to be an advertisement for phenomenology, but I do feel like that is the case for me. So, yeah.
And I would put all those people up there that Brecca just wrote down, first of all, Sartre, and it's interesting, I've read Simone de Beauvoir, and she basically just, she's rewriting Heidegger at the time when they weren't allowed to put Heidegger in France because it would have been thrown out of the academy if they mentioned his name. But her Ethics of Ambiguity, the first 2 or 3 chapters, is basically a translation of the first part of Being in Time.
If you want to start with somebody, Brecca, and you have limited time for interpreting, I feel like maybe you guys could agree. I don't know. I think Merleau-Ponty is a great place to start, but if you haven't done that reading of philosophers, I actually think Steve's is a fantastic way of getting into, it's called...
The Things Themselves?
Things Themselves, The Return of Phenomenology to the Everyday. Is that it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Phenomenology and the Return to the Everyday. And if you just read, they're short, first of all, And because they're short, they are situated very specifically in different places and times. And he does things like one of them is on the animal as first philosophy, and he looks into, he is asking questions like, what is it that makes us human? What is it that makes us animal, etc. So, and they read like I don't know, short looks at phenomenology and philosophy that are accessible to somebody who isn't doing that reading. Because Merleau-Ponty, you're going to wade through some. He's my favorite, I think, but I think you'll wade through it over and over again. Sarah's probably waded through it. She's now swimming in it.
I would almost add David Abrams as well.